Of Thai democracy activists rallied in Bangkok, calling on King Maha Vajiralongkorn to cede control of the royal fortune. At least 7,000 people took to the streets brandishing yellow toy ducks, which have become a symbol of this protest movement. This comes just after Prayut Chan-o-cha's government revived the controversial Les Majest law. Even before the scheduled demonstration began in Bangkok, at least 15 well-known activists were summoned to face charges under the new law. It is the first time in over 2 years that such charges have been filed. But the protesters seem undeterred. The venue of the protest site was changed just last minute. They marched from the headquarters of the Siam Commercial Bank, in which the king is a major shareholder. Back in July, youth and student-led protests began in Thailand. Since then, the demonstrators have had majorly 3 demands. Firstly, the resignation of Prime Minister Prayut Chan-o-cha, who's a former army ruler. Secondly, a new constitution. And finally, reforms and changes to the monarchy to curb its powers. The protesters are also challenging the king's decision to declare crown wealth as his personal property, as the full assets are privately held and remain a closely guarded secret. This has made him by far the wealthiest person in Thailand. Prime Minister Prayut Chan-o-cha has rejected protesters' call to resign. He has said that all laws would be used against the protesters who break them. The scrutiny and public criticism of the monarchy displayed in the past few weeks in Thailand is unprecedented. The country's royal institution is considered the epitome of power in the region. Joining us on this broadcast is Deputy Director of Asia Division, Human Rights Watch, Phil Robertson, who's joining us live from Bangkok. Phil, welcome to WION. Thank you so much for giving us your time. Now, the protesters are demanding that the monarchy also declare its wealth and cede control of the royal fortune. Is this a new demand, or has this been a demand of the protesters always?
This has been a demand that has been ongoing, but it's evolved as the protests have continued. A common theme has been that the protesters are saying, hey, it's our taxes, and therefore we should know what's going on and we should know where this money is. I think that this is similar to what we've seen in other countries, like in the United Kingdom, where in the past there was protests about whether the Queen of England should pay taxes and ultimately issues around that. This is something that is part of the larger resign, rewrite, reform agenda that the protesters have been pushing. And reform primarily means reforming the monarchy.
Right. Now, the total value of the royal holdings is not made public in Thailand, but it has been estimated at more than $30 billion. Does this belong to the people of Thailand, or is this private holdings of the Thai monarch? There needs to be clarity on this, because this has become a major demand of the demonstrators, isn't it?
Well, what has happened, the Crown Property Bureau held money for the monarch. And traditionally this was separate from the monarch. But what changed is when the current king came in, he took control of the fortune directly. So that has been a significant change. This money is, composed of various land holdings and proceeds from those land holdings, contracts to develop malls and hotels and things like that. Also shareholdings. The protest that happened yesterday was in front of the Siam Commercial Bank, which is Thailand's oldest bank. And this is a bank in which the king is the largest shareholder.
Right now, protesters have broken a long-standing taboo by criticizing the king, and police summoned the best-known protesters for questioning. And, they face charges, and they even face 15 years in prison for abusing the monarchy. But all this doesn't seem to have deterred the protesters, because more than 7,000 people once again took to the streets of Bangkok.
Well, it's quite clear that the leaders are saying that they're not intimidated, they're not afraid. that if they're charged with lèse majesté, which is Article 112 of the Penal Code, that they will face those charges. I think that, the more that the monarchy gets involved with this, the more it's going to fuel demands that the protesters are making. The reality is that for several years, there have been no Article 112 charges brought, in part because the palace said that they didn't want that to happen. They recognize that any Article 112 charges look badly for them. And I think now that we see this change, it's very interesting, and we're wondering how this is going to play out next.
Phil, thanks so much for joining us. Like you mentioned, for several years this law hasn't been used, but the real fact that authorities are considering imposing this law shows how grave the situation is for the authorities in Thailand as thousands of protesters continue to take to the streets of the country.